位观众好，欢迎收看26分钟见证实录。在加国有超过620万加拿大人面对某种形式的残障，而且这个数字还在增加当中。为了让残障以及有不同需要的人士能充分融入社区、投入生活，社会各界积极推动建造无障碍环境。而每年从5月的最后一个星期日开始的一连7天就被定为全国无障碍周。为了配合今年的全国无障碍周，在这集的节目，我们分别请来2位知名的无障碍倡导者进行专访，分享他们多年来推动无障碍环境的历程。他们分别为前温哥华市长苏利文 Sam Sullivan， 以及在30多年前就完成用轮椅跨越世界34个国家，以提高社会对残障人士关注的 Rick Hansen。汉森先生您好，感谢您今天接受我们的访问。
Yes, thanks a lot. It's wonderful to be here.
从1985年开始，您的 Man in Motion 轮椅横越世界旅程，至今已经超过35年了。那么回首过去，这个旅程背后的灵感是什么？又是什么促使您踏上如此具有挑战性的旅程呢？
Well, I was injured when I was 15 years old, back in 1973, almost 50 years ago. And at that time, people's attitudes about people with disabilities were pretty limited, mostly a sense of pity, inaccessibility, lack of opportunity. And I inherited that stigma when I was 15, when I had my accident. So my biggest battle was in my internal awareness and attitude about potential and opportunity, shifting from negative to positive. And as I became an athlete and traveled the world, I saw that other people had those attitudes towards me and my colleagues. And also there were physical barriers everywhere. And so after a number of years where I had been able to accommodate to my disability, to feel optimistic and show ability, I felt grateful for all of the support that I had received and thought that I could pay it forward and try to make a difference by doing something that was using my talent at the time as a world champion, an Olympic medalist gold medalist in Paralympic marathoning, and be able to then travel around the world in an ultra marathon of social change, the Man in Motion World Tour, and show what was possible if people with disabilities had barriers removed. And the challenge at that time was to create awareness of the potential of people with disabilities, raise funds for accessibility, and also help drive support for a cure for paralysis one day, so that the next generation may not ever have to have a spinal cord injury. They could actually have full recovery. So that was my motivation, as coming through the experience of living with a spinal cord injury, dealing with disability, and then seeing the barriers that were inside society, mentally, socially, and try to make a difference.
那么旅程当中，哪一些难忘的时刻或者地点让您今时今刻依然记忆犹新呢？
The very first day, being able to start the Man in Motion Tour was one of the greatest challenges and successes, although I didn't do a lot to instill optimism in the 200 well-wishers who came to support me, because as I wheeled through the parking lot underneath a tunnel, my friends who were driving the motorhome, my team, they hit an overhead warning bar and they crashed boxes off the tunnel. And that moment was really symbolic for me. The second highlight for me that represents the dream in motion is that when we were in the country of China, it was such an incredible highlight for me to know that China had opened its doors. And little did I know that a decade earlier, because of the friendship between Deng Xiaoping and Pierre Elliott Trudeau, our Prime Minister in Canada, that they had been friends, and ultimately Deng Xiaoping was the son of Deng Xiaoping, and he had a spinal cord injury, and he came to Canada for life-saving medical support. And he was inspired by social justice in Canada, spinal cord research, and he went back home and with a mission to make a difference. And so China opened its doors and were incredibly gracious, and the response in China was overwhelming. And I was moved and inspired, and ultimately one of the greatest symbols in China was to be able to wheel up the Great Wall to one of the highest places. and having that as a symbol that there are no barriers, no walls too big that can't be climbed, is always indelibly marked in my soul, and it inspires me today.
自您这次的旅程以来，这30多年间，无障碍概念在我们的社会中发生了怎样的变化或者演变呢？
There was a stigma. As we moved through the decades, it started to become considered a human right. And little did I know at that time, the United States of America was advocating for an Americans with Disabilities Act, which would be a legislation that would fundamentally change opportunities for people with disabilities. And Canada has followed suit finally. I know China has followed suit since my Man in Motion World Tour with human rights. The UN Convention on Rights and Freedoms of People with Disabilities has been embedded. So countries around the world are now seeing the social justice part of including people with disabilities as a fundamental right in society. But we're also starting to see, with the advent of technology and new opportunities, the economic and cultural imperative that people with disabilities actually are able to drive an economy, be employees in meaningful ways, be able to contribute with their resiliency and the diversity of their perspective.
那么您认为现时残障人士在无障碍方面面临的一些最大的挑战又是什么呢？
People are still stunned when we tell them that there are over 1.3 billion people on the planet today, according to the World Health Organization, living with a disability. They go, oh my gosh, I had no idea there were so many people. And I believe that's often because disability is fragmented into categories of, are you have a spinal cord injury or a brain injury or Parkinson's disease or arthritis, or are you visual or hearing challenged, or what is the disability? And so it becomes very fragmented. And often our society only sees the symbol of a wheelchair, a stick man in a wheelchair, as the symbol of accessibility. So I think trying to make people understand this is a big deal, and aging baby boomers will also accelerate that number exponentially. Attitudes are getting better, but physical infrastructure and employment opportunities, social welfare supports are still very challenged. Disability is still the #1 issue in human rights lawsuits in Canada.
您可否解释一下要建设无障碍在社会各方面的重要性吗？
You know, the places and spaces that people live, work, learn, and play must be accessible and inclusive to allow people to not only gain access to those opportunities, but to fully participate and contribute. And that's the challenge that we see today. When we look at unemployment figures, they're totally unacceptable. They really represent some of the biggest challenges today. We have over 500,000 people in Canada ready to work if workplaces were accessible to them. And the economic impacts of that are massive. If we were able to become more accessible between now and 2030, we would see probably an understanding that we have $340 billion of consumer spending available. We would have close to $14 billion of tax revenue, and these are huge benefits that come to society if we actually make economies accessible.
您可以分享一些您近年来看到的改善无障碍环境的创新解决方案例子吗？
Our foundation, as an example, has realized that while there are many issues to deal with on disability, that if we tackle the built environment, the places and spaces we live, work, learn, and play, we can actually make those completely accessible. But the big challenge is that there are so many pieces of legislation and that not everyone in the industry of construction and development and design has the competency and the knowledge to make their buildings fully accessible from a universal and inclusive design perspective. And so we decided to bring a world-class expert in accessible design, supported by a world-class curriculum and have that curriculum be available to teach architects, engineers, city planners, developers, and advocates for the disabled so that they would all be speaking the same language of universal and inclusive design and also measuring the same things so we can actually build universal and inclusive design effectively. And then supporting that training program is a rating and certification initiative. And the idea is to rate buildings so that you could actually determine whether a building is not accessible, accessible, or accessibility certified gold. And then those metrics could be available everywhere.
那么您认为科技和创新将可以怎样推动未来无障碍的工作呢？
Technology is one of the greatest enabling opportunities for people with disabilities on the planet today. It's unbelievable, and we saw that during COVID. I mean, COVID obviously forced everyone to be able to reach out virtually, and people with disabilities were able to work remotely, without having to deal with the incredible challenges of getting up 2 hours in the morning earlier than the average person just to get out the door, then the challenges of a commute and getting transportation, and then getting back again. They were able to do that right from their home effectively and utilize technology to maximize their ability. And that's really awesome. Technology is also becoming more responsive to new needs of a very diverse group of people with disabilities, from visual, hearing, mobility, and even from neurodiversity perspective and cognitive challenges. So I really do believe that we're going to see phenomenal opportunities for the future as technology converges to be applying to help people with disabilities have better function and more independence.
我们知道，在 Rick Hansen 基金会有很多不同的项目资助以及研究项目，如今正在进行当中。您可以分享几个您认为最成功的改变人们生活的例子吗？
On the spinal cord research side, which is where we spent a lot of time in the first few decades, and one in Vancouver was the need for a global spinal cord research center, like a hub. And so we brought the Government of Canada, Government of British Columbia, private investment from the Blessons, and they created a $55 million state-of-the-art spinal cord research center right at the hospital site where spinal cord patients are, and bring researchers, clinicians, and people with spinal cord injury together. And that was a really important first step to put spinal cord research and care as a top priority. The second part of that, though, was we wanted that to be a hub of a national and global network. And so we created an institute that was designed to bring collaborators together from around the world, including China, and be able to share knowledge, collaborate together, and accelerate the progress. Spinal cord research and a cure for paralysis is such a big problem. There's only one way we'll solve it, is to be able to unite the world to work in a global way, to be able to put the best of our thinking and our resources into play and then demonstrate that either works, and if it does, then we can actually translate that into action.
那么您已经完成了一次横越世界的旅程，也已经建立了一个基金会。您在促进和教育无障碍方面做了很多的工作。那么下一步您的计划又是什么？您下一个项目又是什么呢？
From our perspective, the goal is to take our certification program, to move it from being a pilot and a startup here in Canada to being a global force for change, a global standard that has over 250,000 accredited professionals, all in the design community, and normalizing the accessibility in the built environment, and knowing that we'll look back in 10 years' time and what people will wonder, what was the big problem and dealing with the buildings? Doesn't everybody know that they're all built totally accessible? That's the vision that we want to see in the next 10 years, and I'm super excited about that.
Hansen 先生，再次感谢您接受我们今天的访问。
Thank you. It's an honor. Appreciate it.
Rick Hansen 及他的基金会多年的工作，令社会上众多不同需求的人士受惠。下一节回来，我们专访的另一位在推广无障碍环境工作上非常有代表性的人物——前温哥华市长苏利文。欢迎回到节目时间。Sam Sullivan 苏利文曾经是温哥华市议员，其后更成为温哥华市长，也当选为卑诗省议员。他本身也是一名残障人士。 而他的工作、努力以及身份，更将温哥华无障碍城市的形象带到国际舞台。肖龙先生您好，感谢您今天接受我们的访问。
Thanks for having me.
首先，请问一下，您能否与我们分享您自己的经历是如何促使您从政，并且成为无障碍工作的倡导者呢？
Well, when I was injured in a skiing accident and I broke my neck and I lost the use of my fingers and legs and some of my arm muscles, like I can't lift my arm above my head, that made me quite aware of all the problems. And so I started to develop programs for disabled people, and we're always running into difficulties with the city, you know. So I thought, okay, well, I should get more involved, and I did, and volunteered in politics, and then ended up being running a candidate, and then being a city councilor.
那么回顾过去，在您担任市议员、温哥华市长以及省议员期间，有没有推动了哪些措施或者政策来促进城市内的无障碍环境呢？
Well, I have to be very honest about this in that I sometimes I say to people, Vancouver is so accessible not because we had a disabled mayor. We had a disabled mayor because it was so accessible. So there was many people that went before me and made it so accessible. There was decades and decades of hardworking people, just citizens, trying to get the city council to make some changes. And so I came along, and lots of it was done, and we just had to keep doing more of it. So I think maybe 50% of all the roads had curb ramps, the corners, and very few buses were accessible. So we just really pushed more effort on that and started, and more like completed the good work that other people started. Fortunately, I had a good narrative because the Paralympics and the Olympics were coming, and the world was going to be watching. I said, we better do this right, you know, so that helped to make the sale, and people said, oh yeah, we better do this, you know.
聊到奥运会呢，在2006年的都灵奥运会的闭幕式上，您从轮椅上挥舞着奥林匹克旗帜的时候，那一刻引起了全世界的关注。您认为这个举动如何有助促进世界以及世界体育界对无障碍的看法呢？
Yeah, well, I think I certainly got a lot of attention internationally, and they say, oh, disabled person can become mayor, you know, what's that about? So they saw, you know, that a city like Vancouver that is very inclusive and very involving and embracing of others, that if you do that, then everybody can participate, and everybody's better off when everybody can be part of the society.
那么在此之后，您是不是收到社会上很多的回应呢？
Yeah, I did. I received all sorts of letters and emails, and you know, all sorts of people coming to Vancouver, and you know, so, and then that helped to advertise the city as a very progressive city.
温哥华市被公认为在无障碍的工作上是领导者。您认为令温市成功的关键因素是什么呢？您认为其他城市可以从温哥华的做法中吸取哪一些经验呢？
Vancouver has a really important accessibility committee. And actually, before I got involved in the city, the government, I went around the province and set up about 30 that were modeled on Vancouver's. So I always found that was very helpful to have that committee, and the people on the committee often would recommend really good things, and you know, because they're seeing it from the inside. So, but it really also is important to have strong advocacy groups. So, you know, we had a lot of little groups that were very committed to accessibility. And we were lucky to have that. Because if you have all the best laws in the world, but nobody advocating, it really won't happen.
请问从您的观察，近年来我们在无障碍工作方面取得了哪些进展？您认为有哪些方面需要更多的关注和改进呢？
One of the problems when you look around here, every fifth or sixth or 10th building has a little tiny stair, and the city has just said that's up to them, it's private property, and we want them to do it. And I think we have to be a little bit more assertive and a little bit more helpful, So there's so many great solutions that I found when I go around the world, and it needs some leadership, to and maybe a little bit of funding, not much. It's just such a small barrier that makes huge difference. So I think that's a really important thing.
您觉得政府和地方当局在为所有民众创造无障碍环境方面应该发挥什么样的作用呢？他们可以如何与个人以及组织合作，以实现这一目标？
Yes, you do need government, but you need citizens who are active and organizations who make it a priority for them to make sure that we have the most accessibility possible. But I must say, Vancouver is like paradise. When I go around the world, even across the country, it's shocking, how, in the U.S., the U.S. has this Disability Act, and everybody thinks, I wish we could have one. None of those cities are more accessible than Vancouver, and Vancouver really didn't have that for most of the time. So, I think it's really important. Citizens have to take responsibility.
您认为我们的社会在哪些方面依然需要努力，才能真正实现无障碍呢？
There's always, the kind of the prejudices of people. They just sort of assume if you're disabled, maybe you, don't have, what it takes to do things. So, but that's actually up to the disabled people to, So I don't believe we have to have everybody doing everything for us. We have to. What I found is when you try to do something and people see that, they like it and they want to be part of the team and they will help you. But, sometimes government messes things up, like with the welfare system. It can be it used to be if you were on welfare and then you made any money, you had to give it to the government, So it was really not, there was no incentive. In fact, there was disincentive to work because, you'd actually, it cost money to go to work, and yet you have to give all your money back, So that's being changed a lot. But still, there's concerns about people who are worried what will happen to their only support.
对于那些希望在未来进一步促进无障碍环境的年轻一代，您有什么建议呢？
It's so important, like I say, the citizens themselves. And, I've got so much out of people who just ask me, maybe my neighbors, what is it that I can help you with? And, can I make your life, how can I help, And that's all you need to ask.
再次感谢您今天接受我们的专访。
Thank you very much for your interest.
好了，这集的节目时间又差不多了。下一节节目我们会看一看我们在城市建设方面无障碍的工作做得如何。如果观众对于我们的节目有任何意见的话，欢迎以电邮的方式与我们联络。我们的电邮地址是mag26@fairchildtv.com。感谢您的收看，我们下期再会。